When the DSM-5 was published in May 2013, it included some 300 disorders in its 945 pages. It offers a veritable smorgasbord of possible labels for the problems associated with severe early life trauma, including some new ones such as disruptive mood regulation disorder, non-suicidal self-injury, intermittent explosive disorder, dysregulated social engagement disorder, and disruptive impulse control disorder. Before the late 19th century, doctors classified illnesses according to their surface manifestations, like fevers and pustules, which was not unreasonable, given that they had little else to go on. This changed when scientists like Louis Pasteur and Robert Koch discovered that many diseases were caused by bacteria that were invisible to the naked eye. Medicine was then transformed by its attempts to discover ways to get rid of those organisms rather than just treating the boils and the fevers that they caused. With DSM-5, psychiatry firmly regressed to early 19th century medical practice. Despite the fact that we know the origin of many of the problems it identifies, its diagnoses describe surface phenomena that completely ignore the underlying causes. Even before DSM-5 was released, the American Journal of Psychiatry published the results of validity tests of various new diagnoses, which indicated that the DSM largely lacks what in the world of science is known as reliability, the ability to produce consistent, replicable results. In other words, it lacks scientific validity. Oddly, the lack of reliability and validity did not keep the DSM-5 from meeting its deadline for publication, despite the near-universal consensus that it represented no improvement over the previous diagnostic system. Could the fact that the APA had earned $100 million on the DSM-4 and is stated to take in a similar amount with the DSM-5, because all mental health practitioners, many lawyers, and other professionals would be obliged to purchase the latest edition, be the reason we have this new diagnostic system? Diagnostic reliability isn't an abstract issue. If doctors can't agree on what ails their patients, there is no way they can provide proper treatment. When there's no relationship between diagnosis and cure, a mislabeled patient is bound to be a mistreated patient. You would not want to have your appendix removed if you are suffering from a kidney stone, and you would not want to have somebody labeled as oppositional when in fact his behavior is rooted in an attempt to protect himself against real danger. In a statement released in 2011, the British Psychological Society complained to the APA that the sources of psychological suffering in the DSM-5 were identified as located within individuals, and overlooked the undeniable social causation of many such problems. This was in addition to a flood of protest from American professionals, including leaders of the American Psychological Association and the American Counseling Association. Why are relationships or social conditions left out? If you pay attention only to faulty biology and defective genes as the cause of mental problems and ignore abandonment, abuse, and deprivation, you are likely to run into as many dead ends as previous generations did, blaming it all on terrible mothers. The most stunning rejection of the DSM-5 came from the National Institute of Mental Health, which funds most psychiatric research in America. In April 2011, a few weeks before DSM-5 was formally released, NIMH Director Thomas Insel announced that his agency could no longer support DSM's symptom-based diagnoses. Instead, the institute would focus its funding on what are called Research Domain Criteria, or RDOC, to create a framework for studies that would cut across current diagnostic categories. For example, one of the NIMH domains is arousal modulatory systems. Arousal, circadian rhythm, sleep, and wakefulness, which are disturbed to varying degrees in many patients. Like the DSM-5, the RDOC framework conceptualizes mental illnesses solely as brain disorders. This means that future research funding will explore the brain circuits and other neurobiological measures that underlie mental problems. Insel sees this as a first step towards the sort of precision medicine that has transformed cancer diagnoses and treatment. Mental illness, however, is not at all like cancer. Humans are social animals, and mental problems involve being not able to get along with other people, not fitting in, not belonging, and in general, not being able to get on the same wavelength. Everything about us, our brains, our minds, and our bodies, is geared toward collaboration in social systems. This is our most powerful survival strategy, the key to our success as a species, and it is precisely this that breaks down in most forms of mental suffering. The neural connection in brain and body are vitally important for understanding human suffering. But it is important not to ignore the foundations of our humanity, relationships and interactions that shape our minds and brains when we are young and that give substance and meaning to our entire lives. People with histories of abuse, neglect, or severe deprivation will remain mysterious and largely untreated, unless we heed the admonition of Alan Sroufe. To fully understand how we become the persons we are, the complex step-by-step evolution of our orientations, capacities, and behavior over time, requires more than a list of ingredients, however important any one of them might be. It requires an understanding of the process of development, how all of these factors work together in an ongoing way over time. Studies on the sequelae of childhood trauma in the context of caregiver abuse or neglect consistently demonstrate chronic and severe problems with emotion regulation, impulse control, attention and cognition, disassociation, interpersonal relationships, and self and relational schemas. In absence of a sensitive trauma-specific diagnosis, such children are currently diagnosed with an average of 3 to 8 comorbid disorders. The continued practice of applying multiple distinct comorbid diagnoses to traumatized children have grave consequences. It defies parsimony, obscures etiological clarity, and runs the danger of relegating treatment and intervention to a small aspect of the child's psychopathology rather than promoting a comprehensive treatment approach. Shortly after submitting our proposal, I gave a talk on developmental trauma disorder in Washington, D.C. to a meeting of the mental health commissioners from across the country. They offered to support our initiative by writing a letter to the APA. The letter began by pointing out the National Association of Mental Health Program Directors served 6.1 million people annually with a budget of $29.5 billion and concluded, "We urge the APA to add developmental trauma to its list of priority areas to clarify and better characterize its course and clinical sequelae, and to emphasize the strong need to address developmental trauma in the assessment of patients." I felt confident that this letter would ensure that the APA would take our proposal seriously, but several months after our submission, Matthew Friedman, Executive Director of the National Center for PTSD and Chair of the relevant DSM subcommittee, informed us that DTD was unlikely to be included in the DSM-5. The consensus, he wrote, was that no new diagnosis was required to fill a missing diagnostic niche. 1 million children who are abused and neglected every year in the United States. A diagnostic niche? The letter went on. The notion that early childhood adverse experiences lead to substantial developmental disruptions is more clinical intuition than a research-based fact. This statement is commonly made, but cannot be backed up by prospective studies. In fact, we had included several prospective studies in our proposal, particularly because they rarely talk about having been hit, abandoned, or molested, even when asked. 82% of the traumatized children seen in the National Child Traumatic Stress Network do not meet diagnostic criteria for PTSD. Because they are often shut down, suspicious, or aggressive, they now receive pseudoscientific diagnoses, such as oppositional defiant disorder, meaning, "This kid hates my guts and won't do anything I tell him to do," or disruptive mood dysregulation disorder, meaning he has temper tantrums. Having as many problems as they do, these kids accumulate numerous diagnoses over time. Before they reach their 20s, many patients have been given 4, 5, 6 or more of these impressive but meaningless labels. If they receive treatment at all, they get whatever is being promulgated as the method of management du jour. Medications, behavioral modification, or exposure therapy. These rarely work and often cause more damage. As the NCTSN treated more and more kids, it became increasingly obvious that we needed a diagnosis that captured the reality of their experience. Frontline mental health workers, overwhelmed and underpaid social workers and therapists alike, seem to agree with our approach.